Okay, destabilization. Barriers may be torn down that would otherwise prevent acceptance of new belief. It includes those who have already been destabilized by life situations and the indoctrination of children who have yet formed a sense of self. I usually explain that there's two dimensions to destabilization. One of them is targeting people who are already destabilized by life's circumstances, because they may be more vulnerable to a new group that hits them with all the love bombing and all the other things that go along with this. And the other side of it then is inducing destabilization in people through messages that they may be broken or unworthy or incapable of handling life without the influence of the group and the social milieu of it. So on this issue of destabilization, how did you feel your experience was?
I think it was closer to the first, where my life was already destabilized. So as I was thinking about gender and in relation to myself, I had come out of a really controlling relationship. I had moved to Toronto and was like trying to settle myself for the first time as an adult.
Mhm.
I tried to go to school. I was in university for a month and a half and then dropped out. Had the worst depressive period of my life shortly after that, and went on antidepressants for the first time. And then 3 months later, I decided that I was going to transition. So that's where it comes for me. That's what I'm thinking in terms of
Yeah.
destabilized. Yeah.
No, that's every single one of those points is a point of psychological vulnerability where you're more open to being receptive to a community that may flood you with positive messages at the front. And when you listen to groups like Scientology and some of these other more religious culty things, they very explicitly say we are looking for people who maybe have moved to a new city for the first time, or maybe are in a point of depression, or in a point where they've lost a loved one to death or illness, or have lost a relationship, because those are the people who need us the most. And so they'll frame it as a positive way, but what they're really saying is we're targeting vulnerable people for bringing them into our group because they'll have a sense of need that we can then fill.
Mhm.
And it sounds like that is what we may be seeing in your own story as well as any outside teenager. When you were talking earlier about that sense of being an outsider, sometimes I wonder if we're doing as good a job as society as letting all teenagers know this is just a part of life. It's a phase that we all go through in our teenage years, and you'll get through it and it'll make sense eventually, but it's hard to convey that to teenagers.
Yeah, I agree.
Being a
And
parent of teenagers myself. Destabilization. There's a lot of conversation right now about the appropriateness of allowing people who have this strong ideological perspective about gender and sexuality to present their way of thinking about these things to children as though it is the right way to think, when other people have different ideas about these things. And they see that as a way of the group destabilizing children themselves. There's this famous meme of a kid saying, I'm not confused about my gender. And then there's the Yoda with the blue hair saying, oh, you will be. Because the idea is that by introducing children to these ideas, you are destabilizing them itself. Do you see that as actually taking place, or what is your experience?
yeah, and it was only just starting to take place when I was still transitioning. Like just right near the
Mm.
end is when it started like being a mainstream thing. And it's been really weird to watch things that I saw on Tumblr in 2010 become things that are being taught to children in classrooms in 2022. It's very strange. And I do see that happening. I have seen like news stories about it.
A California kindergarten teacher is facing outrage after discussing gender identity with her students.
An emotional Rockland Academy teacher addressing a packed house of parents, many furious about her decision to discuss the topic of gender identity inside her kindergarten class.
It was never my intent to harm any students, only to support them through a difficult situation.
The teacher defended her actions to read 2 books she says were given to her by a transgender child going through a transition.
The kindergartners came home very confused about whether or not you can pick your gender, whether or not they really were a boy or a girl.
Many parents say they feel betrayed and blindsided.
I want her to hear from me as a parent what her gender identity means to her and to our family. not from a book that may be controversial.
My daughter went home crying, shaking, so afraid that she could turn into a boy.
It's really about the parents being informed and involved and giving us the choice and the rights about what's getting introduced to our kids.
But also, when I think about this, and when I think about that meme, for example, I think about this idea that we are giving to children this idea that obviously for like our entire lives before this point, we were saying that what we know what makes a man and what makes a woman. And basically it's just genitals and the body. And that's an easy thing for children to understand. It's just depending on what your body looks like, that's what you are. And then now we've switched it where we're telling children under the age of 6 that their preferences are what make them male or female, or something in their mind. They might not say preferences, but they'll say, oh, that your friend knows in their mind, in their head, that they're a woman, even that they're a girl, even though they're actually a boy or whatever. And I just can't understand how anyone could present that idea to children and not think that they're going to understand it incorrectly. It's just so abstract, this idea that, oh, they know in their heart who they are. Those kids are just going to relate it to boys play with trucks and girls want to be ballerinas. It's really setting people up to be very confused.
Story time. This has been my first year in preschool with a class of my own, teaching alongside another queer neurodivergent educator, and we have been rocking our twos class. We've been talking about gender and skin color and consent and empathy and our bodies and autonomy. It's been fabulous. But our teaching team is shifting and a new person is being onboarded, someone with many years of experience. So today at the lunch table, when the topic of gender and genitals came up, one of our students plainly looked up and said, "I'm a girl today, but I know that teacher Co isn't. No, they're NB." And the look on the incoming teacher's face was priceless. She was shocked in a good way, and she just looked around at the two of us and said, "This class is incredible, and I am so impressed."
Yeah, I understand, and I do see that happening.
When you were at your most committed in the frame of belief, we've heard from other activists that part of the reason that there's such a focus on language and such a focus on children is they're trying to shape the way that the next generation thinks about these things so that they can be more tolerant and kind and less hateful and less violent and free up people who otherwise would have had to hide a part of themselves. So it's important that we introduce these ideas to children so that it becomes normalized and they don't see it as something weird or unusual. Would you have gone along with that, or would introducing these ideas to children still have sat with you as maybe not the right way to do that?
I would have been all for it. And if I saw trans children, I would have thought, that's amazing. These parents are letting them live their lives. They're letting them be who they really are, giving them autonomy, etc. And now I'm looking at it thinking they're just they're enabling children in something that they don't fully understand, that it's impossible for them to fully understand until they're a full-grown adult. For example, they're telling children that the doctors will make you the other sex when you grow up. And these children don't understand that they're only going to be virilized women or feminized men. They're not going to be literally the other sex. I don't think that they understand all of the details of it. And they're probably not being told it because it's inappropriate to tell children all of the details of what surgeries are going to look like when they're grown up. So yeah, I would have been all for it. I was all for it. I regret that now with many other things. But yeah.
You think your own experience going through this, including both the medical and surgical dimension as an adult, and still finding that even as an adult, how the medical system prepared you in the notion of informed consent, all of those things, even as an adult, was not carried out in the way that, looking back, maybe you think is appropriate, that then to have that same system be applied to children would be even more dangerous and fraught.
Yeah, it terrifies me. That whole idea of, I was 22 years old and it took me 10 years to really untangle everything to do with gender and realize this actually had to do with this actually had to do with this, make like a nuanced understanding of my identity. It took me 10 years as an adult, but they're expecting children to do this as they're hitting puberty. They're going to block their puberty, and then they're literally developmentally incapable of doing the kind of work that I had to do in order to know that it was the wrong thing. And they expect children to be able to know this at age 12 even. So it's very scary. Yeah.
What would have been the objections you would raise to people in that mode of believing where you were all for it, where if people raise the common objections, we don't allow people to get tattoos until they're of age, even with parental consent in most cases, because it's something that's irreversible and it's not something we can have them consent to, and even other forms of surgery that require parental consent, but allowing a child to do this on their own or having the parent completely defer to the child doesn't make sense for it. How would you have responded to those criticisms?
At that time, I was fully convinced that trans is a thing that you are born. And this is another one of those language games where activists don't really say born in the wrong body anymore, but that is still literally what they mean. When they talk about trans, it's still they were born in the wrong body. You have the wrong brain, quote unquote, or your brain is female or male, and then it's the rest of your body that's, I don't know, quote unquote, wrong. It is still a wrong body narrative, but they don't want you to say born in the wrong body anymore because no body is wrong. But they'll say they'll say that no body is wrong and that trans women can have penises, but also at the same time, Medicaid has to fund getting rid of those penises because some people don't want it. Like, it's a lot of contradictions, basically.
Yeah.
At that time, I just would have been so convinced that anyone who thinks that they're trans is trans, which is one of the mantras that I heard over and over, if you think they're trans, and that would even apply to children. So at that time, I think I just would have said, you're keeping them from living their true lives, their authentic lives, basically just along those lines where it's the same kind of bigotry towards gay people. Basically, children know who they are. I would like all the things that they're saying now, that's what I would have been saying as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can just take trans kids out of that category and of all those other things. This is something different. You can't apply any of those other boundaries to this because this is something totally different. And then all of those mantras that you talked about seems to be what I've encountered in it. Does giving these ideas to children actually destabilize them? Does allowing children to undergo these surgeries and hormones destabilize them? As I've asked this question, many times the response that I get is nobody's doing this to children. All of the haters are using children as an excuse to be able to voice their criticisms, but that's a straw man because nobody's actually doing this to children, and we don't want to do this to children. Is that true?
There's published peer-reviewed articles saying that surgeons have been doing vaginoplasty, which is like the penile inversion surgery, on 16-year-old boys, like back in 2000, I think it was like 2007 or something. Like, they have been doing it for years. It was back then, it was very rare to be doing it on someone that young. I don't think it's as rare now. And there are so many examples that you can pull out of nowhere. Jazz Jennings had vaginoplasty at 17 years old on national television. So we can't say that it's not happening to minors when it's literally happening right in front of our eyes.
For this video, I wanted to talk about my upcoming gender confirmation surgery. So I'm actually super excited for it. It's crazy to me. I'm gonna have new genitalia, like penis to vagina. That's some serious shit, y'all. It's all happening, it's all real, and I'm not concerned about it. I trust my surgeons, so I'm not worried about complications. I guess the only concern I do have is that I'm getting a different procedure. Because I started the blockers so early, I never went through puberty. So I don't know if you guys, some of you know what the blockers are, but if you haven't heard of the blocker, I got this implant in my arm. I've got it replaced 3 times over the years, but basically it blocks testosterone in my body so that I don't develop as a male and get like a beard, mustache, deep voice, and that's why I've been able to be so feminine. But because of that, it caused me to be so suppressed that I didn't have growth in that region. And because there was a lack of tissue, they really didn't have enough material to construct the entire vagina. So they're using a special procedure where they extract my peritoneal lining, which is basically this like thin membrane that surrounds the stomach, and it's regenerative, so it'll regrow and whatnot. And they harvest it and use that to create the vaginal canal. And it's better because it looks more like real vagina tissue, and it feels more like real vagina tissue, and it just creates more depth for me because having that extra material will allow them to make a bigger canal. And then because I'm doing this new procedure, it is experimental still, and they haven't like fully finished it, or not finished it, but it hasn't been done on like hundreds, thousands of people as the other technique has. So it's a little concerning because something could go wrong, or you don't know what's gonna happen. The surgery is exciting, my life's exciting, and I want you all to enjoy the ride with me.
But also, there are double mastectomies happening on 13-year-olds, hysterectomies happening on 17-year-olds. They're happening. And if they weren't happening, then we wouldn't have puberty blockers. Like, the puberty blockers are mostly only being given to children of puberty age. I do hear that anti-androgens are very similar to puberty blockers, and they're being given to males in like their 20s and 30s. But yeah,
well, those are good points. And I think there was a recent controversy with Children's Hospital in Boston publishing some videos where the surgeons involved there were alluding to procedures that could be done potentially on children. And when the outcry was raised, those videos were taken down with some denials that this was being done on children. But the published reports of the doctors involved contradicted that.
Many surgical centers require you to be 18. At Boston Children's Hospital, for top surgeries, we'll see people as young as age 15 if they've been affirmed in their gender for a long period of time and don't really have any other life complications that make surgery inappropriate.
So it seems like there's this sense of acknowledgement that there's bad optics to some of this stuff being done to children, which is where those objections come from. It seems to be another one of those contradictions where we have to, in one sense, fight for children to have these therapies on one side and then deny that's going on the other side. The question of stabilization, I'm hearing more and more listening to detransitioners where they'll feel like they were going through a relatively normal childhood with some stressors, certainly, and some discomfort with the changes of puberty. And then they go on this journey of the trans community, which increases a great deal of their anxiety, their depression, their fixation on bodily issues, on the oppression and all the negative things that they have. And it seems to just derail them. And then as they eventually pull themselves out of the trans existence and the trans community, they're able to regain a sense of themselves and start to build themselves up. And the question that a lot of people have is, well, was that journey necessary? Did their experience going through this problem put them at higher risk for things like suicide and depression than they would have had if they had received some of the more conventional therapies for teens and adolescents going through some of those normal stressors that happen in those years? And I don't know that the data is out on that. What is your understanding?
Like in terms of, I guess, detransitioners looking back, whether or not...
Both on, if they feel like their journey did them good or if it put them at higher risk, as well as if people are affirmed and they do go through all of this surgery, do they actually end up doing better or not? And there may be populations for which that's true and populations for which that's not true. What do you think?
I think that's where we're at, where different populations do differently. Because obviously I look back on my own story and feel like it was a completely unnecessary journey. It was like a detour, basically. In that sense, it is destabilizing. It was like I was in crisis, basically. I came up with something that I felt was the answer, and then all of the professionals agreed with me and were like, oh, yes, that's the answer. And then so I went on that path for 10 years when I could have been doing something else, when I could have been building resilience or learning emotional regulation or just all of these things that I didn't think about because I wasn't diagnosed. And part of my thing is I feel like I was robbed of like differential diagnosis. I feel like they should have done screening for autism and ADHD and some other things instead, or at least in addition to. And if I knew that I had those back then, maybe I could have started creating coping mechanisms that would have worked rather than just transitioning, which was a different coping mechanism that did nothing for me in the long term. So I'm sure there are people like me that have that sort of experience of it where they feel like it was completely unnecessary and so on. But I know there are other people who feel like it was part of their journey and they needed to transition in order to know it wasn't the right thing. I think I'm a little bit more, what's the word? I don't feel as good about it as they do, basically. And it's hard to say because, again, the data's not there. And then the people who have transitioned, there's so few long-term studies saying whether or not it was ultimately a good thing for them. And we don't really know what cross-sex hormones do to people in the long term. So I'm told that there's more evidence about estrogen in males than testosterone in females. But it's hard to say because there's that one article that keeps getting cited in which the suicide rates are 19 times higher, somewhere 8 to 10 years after surgery, are higher than the general population. So it doesn't seem like it's necessarily doing them better. And I think it's also a really tough thing to assess because people are motivated to lie about whether or not transition was good for them or not. I think they have a really strong, it has to do with it's like a cognitive distortion, basically. Just that whole transition is always good. They can't really admit to themselves that whether or not it was bad for them, I think.
Well, that's an interesting dynamic. I know when I've talked to former Scientologists and former Jehovah's Witnesses, they'll say that when they were in their believing mode, even if they were experiencing very significant negative effects of their group, the Scientologist in particular felt like he was a slave and imprisoned in the group, but he couldn't see that as his state of being. He had to define it and express it publicly as a good thing and a positive thing in his life. And it was only after he left it that he could look back and say, I was compelled to frame it as that, even though I was miserable because I hadn't yet unpacked all the different things about the false assumptions that I had been indoctrinated to base my judgment on. And it sounds like research then may have that confounding factor when they deal with people. Like in the early phases of your own medicalization journey, before you had gotten to the point where you decided that you were headed out of that way of being and thinking, would you have defined it and answered any medical research questionnaires as, yes, this was better for me, I'm much better now? Or how would you have framed it?
That's how I would have framed it. I would have just said, oh yeah, it was life-saving. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. And I think I might have even said that all the way up until when I detransitioned, which there wasn't a lot of doubt for it. It wasn't, I don't want to, it's not doubt. It was like my commitment was still there. The commitment to just, I guess, the ideology itself. It was still there, that all the way until I detransitioned. And then the week that I detransitioned was a very tough week of just introducing myself to all of the things that I wasn't allowed to think over the course of a week. Yeah.
Yeah. I can relate to that experience for just even in the religious realm. It's almost like a switch goes off. Once you allow yourself to really consider that the foundational assumptions of your belief are actually wrong, then there's like this whole castle of cards that comes tumbling down, but it takes you a while to realize how far and how deep that goes. For me, it was like the founding prophet of my religion. As soon as I accepted the possibility that he may have been a religious charlatan and his claims to have seen God and done things were based on deception, then it just totally changed in very rapid succession how I interpreted and contextualized things about the group as well as assumptions I'd made about myself and the world. It's life-changing, and I could see how that kind of can flood you and be a very overwhelming experience.
Yeah, it was very much like that, yeah.
This question of destabilization, then let's go back to our scoring, because I know we're taking more time on each of these questions, but I feel like there's a whole lot to dig through for each one. What do you think, both in exploiting the vulnerabilities of already destabilized people as well as destabilizing people in a way that kind of keeps them continually dependent on the group?
I'm going to say intense.
Okay.
Yeah.